Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, November 6th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today: Israel has not come close to destroying Hamas. So despite the massive bombing campaign and ground invasion in Gaza, a senior Pentagon official believes Israel has not come close to taking out Hamas's leadership. And this was reported by the New York Times on Saturday. So the report reads, quote, one senior U.S. defense official who spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive details said the operations so far have not come close to destroying Hamas's senior and middle leadership ranks, end quote. So according to Gaza's health ministry, at least 9,770 Palestinians have been killed in the Israeli onslaught, including 4,008 children. So think about that death toll. And I know Biden has tried to say that they're lying about this, but then you had the UN and aid groups that operate on the ground saying that it's reliable, and they actually believe the number to be higher because it doesn't count everybody under the rubble and people that were buried before, instead of sending their bodies to the hospital. So anyway, this New York Times report said that the U.S. was making suggestions to Israel to reduce civilian casualties, such as using smaller bombs. Apparently, that's one suggestion the U.S. gave to Israel. But when it comes down to it, the Biden administration is refusing to leverage military aid or refusing to use any kind of leverage over Israel. According to the Washington Post, the U.S. is not conditioning military aid or using other leverage it has over Israel because, and this is a quote from the article, I wanted to read this excerpt. It says, quote, it would be so politically unpopular in any administration, and partly because aides say Biden himself has a personal attachment to Israel, end quote. And this Washington Post article is actually about how the U.S. is supposedly so frustrated that Israel's killing so many civilians, but they just can't do anything about it. But then it, reveals, buried in the story, is this fact that, well, they're not actually trying to really do anything about it. This is just them, trying to cover themselves, as it's very clear that they are supporting this mass slaughter in Gaza. So the Washington Post report also said that White House advisors believe Israel's ground invasion of Gaza would only lead to destabilization and escalation. So here you have officials, again, speaking just to the media, saying that the ground invasion is a bad idea, but regardless of that, they are supporting it, 100%. And the White House is seeking another $14 billion to keep funding this war. So it's just, you're seeing it again. It seems like they're kind of trying to wash their hands of this and say, look, we don't think any of this is a good idea. We know they're killing a lot of civilians. That's not good. But when it comes down to it, they're not doing anything to stop it. So Blinken was just in Israel on Friday, and while he was there, he suggested a humanitarian pause. But the idea was rejected by Netanyahu. He said they're going to keep going. No pauses, no ceasefires. And then the following day, and this was on Saturday, Blinken traveled to Amman, Jordan, and met with Arab leaders who called for a real ceasefire. And this is an idea that the administration has rejected. While he was there, Blinken said, quote, it's our view that a ceasefire now would simply leave Hamas in place and able to regroup and repeat what it did on October 7th, end quote. So despite what this narrative they're trying to craft, that they are upset about all these civilian casualties, again, they're just not doing anything about it. And the support that they're giving Israel is unconditional. All right, the next one here. The Pentagon says that the U.S. is flying drones over Gaza to look for hostages. So the Pentagon has acknowledged that the U.S. is flying drones over Gaza to help Israel locate hostages, and this really demonstrates how deeply involved the U.S. is in this war. Pentagon spokesman Brigadier General Pat Ryder said on Friday, quote, "In support of hostage recovery efforts, the U.S. is conducting unarmed UAV flights over Gaza, as well as providing advice and assistance to support our Israeli partner as they work on their hostage recovery efforts," end quote. So they're using MQ-9 Reaper drones for these surveillance flights, which can be armed with very powerful missiles. So they're not, it's not, we don't know if the drones are actually armed that are making the flights, but we know that the MQ-9s can carry, Hellfire missiles and things like that. So at least, this is according to the New York Times, at least 6 MQ-9 Reaper drones are involved in these operations. So they're doing a lot of flights. It's not just a drone here and there. And this suggests that the U.S. is taking a more active role in the war than previously known. The U.S. has also deployed special operations forces to Israel, which I covered last week. And U.S. officials say that the American commandos are in Israel to help locate hostages and insist that they're not assigned to combat roles. But the reality is, who knows what they're really doing there. And these drone flights started just a few days after October 7th. So again, this has been happening for a while, these flights. So it seems like it's at a pretty significant level that the U.S. is flying these drones over Gaza. And I believe this is the first time I've heard of the U.S. doing something like this over Gaza. And besides this type of support, the U.S. has also deployed the aircraft carrier, strike groups, more fighter jets, more troops to the region. Just a lot of things moving around. All right, so the next one here, satellite images show scale of destruction in Gaza. So this is a story from Axios, and they just put together a lot of the satellite views of the war, kind of the before and after, just really showing you how much damage these Israeli strikes are doing. And it's just, again, just leveling entire neighborhoods. It's really something to see what it looks like before and after. It's just, just destroying these cities. And they have a good chart here that says in North Gaza, in the area of northern Gaza that Israel told to evacuate, about 25% of all the buildings have been damaged by Israeli airstrikes. And this chart points out that they have been continuing to launch airstrikes south of the evacuation zone. So they're telling them to get out of the north, but they're still launching airstrikes in the south. There's definitely a lot more in the north, but still, there's a significant amount in the south as well. And Israel's saying that they've cut off, they're trying to cut off the north from the south and encircle Gaza City. And they say that they have encircled the city. So you have to think there's going to be really a lot of heavy fighting once they really push into the center of it. It's not really clear how heavy it is. I haven't seen an update on Israeli casualties in a while, but I'm sure things will become more clear as time goes on here. So the next one here, this is just an article from Al Jazeera about how the child death toll has crossed 4,000 as airstrikes have intensified. And on Sunday afternoon, an Israeli airstrike hit several houses near a school at the Broaches refugee camp in central Gaza, killing at least 13 people, and that's according to officials at the Al-Aqsa hospital. So that's just one strike. Since the last time I did a show, there's been so many airstrikes. It's tough to figure out what to update you on, but at least I know on Friday at the Al-Shifa hospital, Israel bombed an ambulance that was loading up with people. Israel's claiming there was Hamas militants in the ambulance. They've offered no evidence. And the doctors and people that work at the hospital said that they were loading the ambulance up with people that were wounded who were going to be able to evacuate through the Rafah border crossing into Egypt. So since then, they've closed that border crossing again to people who want to get out. So it's just really horrific what's going on there in Gaza. And again, they're saying over 4,000 children. It's just, it's unbelievable. So the next one here, an Israeli minister says that nuking Gaza is an option. So this is Israel's heritage minister, Amichai Eliyahu. I probably butchered his name. But he said that dropping a nuclear bomb on the Gaza Strip was an option for Israel and claimed that there are no innocent civilians in the enclave. So according to the Times of Israel, Eliyahu said in a radio interview that dropping a nuke is one of the possibilities and said that there are no such things as uninvolved civilians in Gaza. He also called for the expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. He said, quote, "They can go to Ireland or deserts. The monsters in Gaza should find a solution by themselves," end quote. So he added that the Gaza Strip does not have the right to exist and that anyone waving a Hamas or Palestinian flag shouldn't continue living on the face of the earth. So he is a member of the extremist Atzma Yehudit party, which means Jewish power in English. And this is the party that's led by Itamar Ben-Gvir. He was kind of the most controversial member of Netanyahu's new coalition. These guys are really extreme, and these are, part of the group of people that make up the Netanyahu government, which came into power at the end of December 2022 and pledged to expand settlements in the West Bank and ultimately annex the West Bank. And since then, there's been such an uptick. This is before October 7th. Israeli raids in the West Bank. Over 200 Palestinians were killed before October 7th in 2023. The heaviest violence in the West Bank since the early 2000s. So that was all going on before the big Hamas attack on southern Israel. So in response to these comments, Netanyahu suspended Eliyahu from cabinet meetings. He resisted calls from opposition leader Yair Lapid to fire him. And Netanyahu said, quote, "Minister Eliyahu's statements are not based in reality," end quote. And despite, again, the massive casualty rate in Gaza, Netanyahu is claiming that Israel is operating in accordance with international law to avoid harming innocents, but that's pretty tough to believe when you see what's actually happening. And besides how provocative this statement is, and really genocidal if he's calling to nuke the Gaza Strip, his comments also appear to confirm that Israel has nuclear weapons. So that's another thing that Netanyahu might not be happy about, because Israel does have a nuclear arsenal, but it has a policy of ambiguity and does not officially recognize that nuclear arsenal exists. And the U.S. has the same policy. The U.S. does not acknowledge that Israel has this secret nuclear weapons program and stockpile. But, they're always going on about Iran, which does not have nuclear weapons. All right. So the next one here, largest Palestine protest in U.S. history shut down the streets of D.C. So this article is from Mondo Weiss, and it's estimated that 300,000 demonstrators shut down the streets of D.C. in the largest Palestine protest in United States history, calling for a ceasefire and an end to the genocide in Gaza. So this was on Saturday. And protesters gathered in Freedom Plaza, where organizers delivered speeches and led chants in support of Gaza before marching to the White House. So if you saw this over the weekend, there's lots of pictures here, and 300,000 sounds like a huge number, but it definitely looked like a lot. There was a lot of people. They surrounded the White House, and it goes to show that there's a lot of opposition to what Biden is doing, what Biden is supporting in Gaza. And, a lot of these people are Democrats and on the left. And it's, we're also seeing dissent within the State Department. So it's, I think Biden's in trouble with this when it comes to the upcoming election, even though it's hard to imagine him really, doing another 4 years. But I think this could be bad for him, the whole Gaza situation. All right, so the next one here, hospitals struggle to treat wounded children after Israeli airstrike. So this is an article from AP on Friday, and it just kind of really explains the way that it's written. I don't know, it just like had an impact on me And I think it kind of explains what the situation is actually like for these people in these hospitals. So the gray film covering the faces of children rushed to Al-Aqsa Hospital in central Gaza Thursday made it hard to distinguish between the living and the dead, after 2 Israeli airstrikes flattened an entire block of apartment buildings in the Broaches refugee camp and damaged 2 UN schools turned shelters. Rubble-covered Palestinians, big and small, arrived at a hospital too packed to take them in. Tiny, motionless bodies lay flat against the hospital's hard floor. A small boy bled out on the tiles as medics tried to staunch the flow from his head. A baby lay next to him with an oxygen mask strapped on, covered in ash. His chest struggled to rise and fall. Their father sat beside them. Yeah, I just thought that was kind of a real brutal description of kind of one anecdote about a situation in a hospital floor in Gaza, just to get an idea of how horrific it is and see what our government is supporting. All right, so the next one here, Blinken visits Iraq as attacks continue. So Blinken made a surprise visit to Iraq on Sunday amid a spate of attacks on U.S. troops in the region over U.S. support for Israel's onslaught on Gaza. U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria have come under attack 32 times, including a drone that was launched at a base in Syria on Sunday. So these attacks have not stopped. And if you remember, the U.S. launched airstrikes in eastern Syria on October 27th. The idea was to deter future attacks, but the strategy has clearly failed. So while Blinken was in Iraq, he said, quote, "I made very clear that attacks or threats coming from militias that are aligned with Iran are totally unacceptable, and we will take every necessary step to protect our people," end quote. Blinken met with Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani and thanked him for condemning the attacks on U.S. troops. And he said that al-Sudani is working with his own security forces to prevent more attacks. So many of the Shia militias and political factions in Iraq are strongly opposed to the U.S. military presence in the country in general. And it seems like they're using the opportunity that they have to try to drive them out with all these attacks. There hasn't been any U.S. troops killed so far. There's been some minor injuries, but again, if these continue, we shouldn't be surprised if we start to see some real casualties incurred here. But there's been a real movement to push the U.S. out of Iraq since 2020, since January 2020, when President Trump assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general that he killed in a drone strike in Baghdad. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Soleimani was killed alongside Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was also killed in the strike. And he was an Iraqi militia leader who led the Popular Mobilization Forces, which is an umbrella group of mostly Shia militias. And it's a state-sponsored group. It was formed in 2014 to fight ISIS. So these people were U.S. allies in the war against ISIS. And then they became enemies because the U.S. needed a new enemy, to stay in Iraq. So after Soleimani and al-Muhandis were killed, Iraq's parliament voted to expel U.S. troops, and Iraqi prime ministers have been under pressure since then to get them out. In an effort to placate, these anti-U.S. factions, the U.S. formally changed its presence in Iraq from a combat role to an advisory role, and that was in December 2021. But at the time, they didn't withdraw any troops. So the troops stayed. There's 2,500 U.S. troops still in Iraq today. And when it comes to the attacks on U.S. forces, a group that calls itself the Islamic Resistance in Iraq has taken credit for many of them. Both attacks in Iraq and Syria, these militias do operate in both countries, and I know sometimes they say that they fire rockets from Iraq at U.S. bases in Syria. And the U.S. is saying Iran is ultimately responsible for all these attacks because they support some of these Shia militias, but there's no evidence. We haven't seen anything, saying definitively that Iran is ordering, directing these attacks. So that's always something to keep in mind. All right, so the next one here, a woman and 3 children killed in an Israeli airstrike in South Lebanon. So fighting between Hezbollah and Israel, the cross-border strikes, has continued. Oh, Nasrallah, the Hezbollah chief, he gave his big speech on Friday. A lot of people expected him to formally declare war. He did not, but, he had a lot of stern warnings. And, dozens, over 50 Hezbollah fighters have been killed since this has started. So, I mean, if you're living in South Lebanon or northern Israel, you would think that you're at, they're at war. People have had to evacuate their homes. Houses have been destroyed. And in this case, this article is from AP. An Israeli airstrike in South Lebanon on Sunday evening killed 4 civilians, including a woman and 3 children, raising the likelihood of a dangerous new escalation in the conflict on the Lebanon-Israel border. Israeli troops and Hezbollah militants and their allies have been clashing for a month along the border since the start of the Israel-Hamas war. While clashes remain largely contained, they have increased in intensity as Israel conducts a ground incursion in Gaza against Hezbollah ally Hamas. So Lebanon's state-run national news agency reported that 2 civilian cars carrying members of the same family, one of them a local journalist, were driving between the towns of Ainada and Tarun on Sunday evening when they were hit by an Israeli airstrike. One of the cars was hit directly and burst into flames. 1 woman and 3 girls, ages 10, 12, and 14, were killed and others were wounded. Shortly after the strike, Hezbollah said its fighters had fired Grad rockets from southern Lebanon into Israel in response. And Hezbollah, I think, they're saying that they're going to do more. So just not a good situation. And again, there's still this risk of a really big escalation. All right, the next one here, this is a big story. And if, everything else wasn't related to Gaza, this would be way up, closer to the top of the page. But so the U.S. finally broaches the idea of peace talks with Ukraine. So NBC News reported on Friday that U.S. and European officials have brought up the possibility of peace talks with Russia in conversations with the Ukrainian government. And this is a big shift because the U.S. and its allies had discouraged the idea of peace talks since Russia invaded in February 2022. This whole time, they've said no ceasefire, no negotiations. It's up to Ukraine, and we know Zelensky's not going to do it. So this is a big deal here. And this report said that the conversations have included a very broad outline of what Ukraine might need to give up to reach a deal. Some of the talks took place last month at a meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, and this is a grouping that has held meetings since Russia invaded Ukraine. It includes military representatives from about 50 countries. The talks about negotiations with Russia started due to Western concerns about the situation on the battlefield and the fact that it's becoming more difficult to keep funding the war. Recent reports have revealed that Ukrainian officials do not believe they can win the war, except for Zelensky. He's still holding on hope. I covered these other 2 reports that were also pretty big. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief General Valery Zaluzhny described the war as a stalemate and said that there will not be a beautiful breakthrough, as he put it. A close aide to Zelensky told Time magazine that Zelensky was deluding himself into believing Ukraine could win, adding that they're out of options. Ukraine's not winning. And again, this is one of Zelensky's aides. And one thing that this NBC report said, that another big concern of the Biden administration is that they don't think Ukraine has the manpower to keep this war going. And that's something that the Time magazine report said as well. The U.S. says these officials that were the sources for the NBC report say that even if they gave Ukraine all the weapons they need, they might not have the manpower to keep the war going. And that a Ukrainian official said something similar to Time magazine. So, what really, makes me angry about this is just the fact that it's, November 2023. Russia invaded in February 2022. And they could have, reached a deal in the very beginning. There was peace talks in March 2022 and April 2022. And I've covered pretty extensively how the U.S. and its allies discouraged those talks, and there's a lot of evidence that they actually blocked the deal from happening. There was the big report that first came out was from Ukrainska Pravda, which is Ukrainian media. That said that at the time, Boris Johnson, who was still the British Prime Minister, went to Kiev in April 2022 and told Zelensky, even if you're ready to negotiate with Putin and sign a deal, we're not. And they said he was speaking for the collective West. There's been other evidence. Naftali Bennett, who was the Israeli prime minister at the time, was mediating between Zelensky and Putin. He said his efforts were blocked by the U.S. and its allies. And just recently, so Ted Snyder wrote up an article about this for antiwar.com. I should have covered it as a news story because it is kind of a big deal. Former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, he recently said that he was playing a mediating role during some of these 2022 peace talks and that he believed no deal was reached because of the U.S. So he said he was mediating because Ukraine asked him to. He said, quote, "My impression, nothing could happen because everything else was decided in Washington. The Ukrainians did not agree to peace because they were not allowed to. They first had to ask the Americans about everything they discussed," end quote. So at the time, Russia's main demand for a peace deal was Ukrainian neutrality. There were some vague things about demilitarization, denazification that I think were up for interpretation, but the main thing was they wanted Ukraine to be neutral, and they weren't asking for territory. Of course, they would want them to recognize Crimea as Russian, but now, they've annexed all the territory that they control, and they have said quite a few times, the Kremlin has said that any future peace deal must recognize these territories as Russian. So Ukraine not only lost, so many people since then, they're going to lose territory. Realistically, in any deal, they're not in any good position to negotiate. This report says that the U.S. is considering NATO offering some sort of security guarantees to Ukraine, but that's going to be a non-starter for Russia. And time is on Russia's side. They believe they can wait out the West, and I think this is evidence that they can. And the difficulty Biden is having getting more money to spend on this proxy war. Russia right now isn't going to settle, I don't think, for any kind of deal that involves NATO giving Ukraine security guarantees. I just can't picture that happening. But I don't know. Hopefully, this moves along and this war ends and there's some kind of peace deal that lasts. All right, the next one here. The U.S. announces a new $425 million weapons package for Ukraine. This is from Kyle Anzalone. And despite, reality sinking in, they're still shipping weapons over there. So they're sending Ukraine weapons through the Presidential Drawdown Authority. That's worth $125 million. Sending additional munitions for air defenses, the HIMARS rocket systems, artillery rounds. And then they're also pledging $300 million in the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which is a Pentagon program that lets them buy weapons for Ukraine. And they're getting laser-guided munitions to counter unmanned aerial systems, so some sort of anti-drone system that they're going to be purchasing. And apparently this is the last of this Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative funding. It's all dried up. Pentagon still has around $5 billion to play with when it comes to the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which lets them ship weapons straight to Ukraine. But that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from David Stockman. Uncle Sam doesn't have one thin dime for Joe Biden's $106 billion war package. We have one from James Carden. Kurt Campbell, the lobbyist as diplomat. One from Brian McGlinchey. No country has a right to exist, in quotes there. One from James Bamford, how Israel secretly influences American politics. One from Aaron Mate, in Gaza, Biden is an equal partner in Israel's mass murder. Okay, that is everything. That's it. You could go check out the blog. Also, I know I mention once in a while all the stuff that we run lower in the page. Today, over this weekend, things really piled up, especially the Gaza and Israel stuff. We just have a ton of stuff down there about certain airstrikes and certain things going on the ground in Gaza. Also, the world reaction, protests and ambassadors being expelled, and the situation in the West Bank. At least 9 Palestinians were just killed in the West Bank. So again, just so much going on. It's been tough to figure out, what we should be focusing on for the day because there's so much news. You could always support this show by sharing it, liking, subscribing on YouTube or Odyssey, Rumble, wherever you prefer to watch. I did Timcast on Friday night, so go check that out. Let me know what you think. Let me know how I did on there. That's it for me for today. I'll be back with some more news for you tomorrow. Thanks for listening.